In this video, I'm going to be showing you the basics of how to set up and use a coal fire. Hi, I'm Dennis Frechette and welcome back. In this video, I'm going to be going over all the basics of how to set up and maintain a coal fire. If you're watching this video, I'm assuming that you have some experience with using coal and you're probably a little frustrated and want some answers. So that's basically what I'm here to do. I'm going to go over everything right from the very beginning, setting up. I'm going to show you the dimensions of the fire pot, give you everything that I am using in my videos, and show you how I go about it. So hopefully that'll solve some of the problems for you. So that's in part one. In addition to the new video, I've added 3 of my older videos that are related because they basically deal with designing the fire pot and the forge hood. This is another reference video, so the link to all of the other reference videos that I have in this series are going to be in the description. So if you find one of them, you'll be able to go to all the others by just looking at the description. I highly recommend that you save them as a playlist, or at least in your watch later folder, so that they're easy to refer back to. And if you have any questions, you'll know where to go. So that's what I have for you today. Hope it helps you out. I'm going to start today by giving you a tour of my forge that I'm using right now. This fire pot is based on my original forge that I purchased back in 1975, and it was an old Buffalo forge setup. It had the big cast iron pan and the blower, which I'm still using. Everything else is gone, unfortunately. I didn't have room for it when I moved into this shop. But what they had done is they had cut out the original firebox from this pan and inserted a larger firebox, and I was able to recycle that firebox into the forge that I used up until about 10 years ago. There was a crack in the body of it. It got too bad, so I had to replace it, and this is what I replaced it with. It's just made out of 1/4-inch plate, and it's welded together, and you can see that I have a straight bar grill at the bottom of it. And the reason I like that is because you can get a poker in there when the fire is going. You don't have to dismantle your fire to get to any kind of a blockage. If you use the shower drain style of forge where it's just a bunch of holes drilled, you can't find what's causing the problem. So you have to take apart your fire, clear the grate out, and then rebuild your fire. This way you can get a poker in there, clean out whatever's causing a problem, and you just keep going. So here's a quick look at the underside, and you can see I didn't spend much time cutting plates that didn't need to be cut. The 2 side plates had to be beveled, of course, and then the end plates could be just left square, so that's what I did. I get asked a lot how I can get away with building a forge out of just mild steel plate. Well, the answer is because I have a hand-cranked blower. The intermittent fire doesn't allow the fire pot to heat up. So you can see on the outside, there's no scaling at all. If I had an electric blower, on the other hand, and it was running the whole time, well, then the whole fire pot would have enough time to get red hot. It would start scaling, and then that would cause a problem. But the way it is now, I can use it for years. The top of the fire pot is approximately 11 inches long. It's about 7 inches wide, and the sides taper down to a base that's approximately 4 inches by 4 inches. The total depth is just around 5.5 to 6 inches. And I find these dimensions to be just about right. As it stands, it's a nice fire pot for doing smaller work, and if I need to heat up something a little larger, I can easily bank up another 2 or 3 inches of coal around the outside edges to heat up anything that I'm likely going to be hammering out by hand. What you're looking at here are the 3 things that are found in every coal fire. The first thing, of course, is the coal that you started off with. And it's a soft coal. It's usually referred to as a bituminous coal, and it has a lot of impurities in it, and that's fine because when the impurities burn off, you get a substance called coke, and that's what you want in the center of your fire. Coke is what raw coal turns into once it's been heated in the fire. If you use a firewood analogy, coal is the same as firewood. It has some heat potential, but it doesn't really get hot until it gets turned into charcoal. Coke is the equivalent of charcoal. That's what you want in the center of your fire. It burns super hot and super clean. And the third thing you're going to find in a fire, unfortunately, is clinkers. And clinkers are basically just waste materials. It's all the stuff in the fire that doesn't burn, but it gets hot enough to melt into a big lump. Now, there are two main problems with having clinkers in your fire. First of all, they're a big lump that has no volatile matter at all. So it doesn't contribute to the fire, it just takes up space. And the second problem is a real concern if you're doing any forge welding, because some clinkers can actually off-gas and prevent a forge weld from taking. So in either case, you need to get them out of there. Smaller clinkers are fairly easy to remove. You can fish them out with your poker. But if you have coal that's a little dirtier and produces a lot of clinker, they can actually form a bird's nest right around the base of your fire. And the only way to get rid of them is to clear the coals out, fish out that big ring out of there, and start over. So if you come across something in your fire that's noticeably harder than everything else and not as hot as everything else, then that's a clinker, and you need to just drag it to the edge of the fire and get it out of there. When it comes to starting a forge fire, you're going to get a lot of different opinions. For example, I use a torch. I think that works best in my situation. It's portable, it's easy to use, and I don't have any combustibles sitting around my shop. A lot of people still prefer to use crumpled up newspapers or whatever other kind of paper that's available nowadays. Some people will use wood. They'll build a small wood fire, throw their coal on top of that. That's fine. Some people build full-blown campfires in their fire pot and then start their fires that way. I mean, they're definitely not taking any chances. Now, the crumpled up newspaper or the torch only work well if you have coke left over from a previous fire that you could use to start the new fire, because coke lights up very quickly, it gets very hot, and it produces no smoke. So you only need a real short, intense fire to get coke going. If this is your first forge fire and all you have to work with is raw coal, then you need to have a much longer heat source that can provide the heat that you need to get the coal up to temperature, and you need flames that can be used to consume the smoke that's being produced by the impurities in the coal burning off. And wood is your only practical solution for that. Now that I have a good wood fire going, I can start taking the raw coal, which I have piled up here on the edge of the fire pot, and I can start introducing it to that fire. But I'm only putting it around the outside edges. I'm not putting anything on top of the fire. I want that flame to be very active in the center of the fire, because that's sucking up all of the smoke that's being generated by the coal turning into coke. So the wood fire itself is producing absolutely no smoke. What you're seeing around the outside edges is the white smoke that's coming from the coal. So the impurities are starting to burn off, and that happens at a very, very low heat. The coal here has not ignited. It's just being warmed up by the fire, and that's driving all the impurities off. If I were to cut the air blast off right now and left it, once all the wood was consumed, the fire would go out, because there's nothing else burning in this fire. So even though it's been a few minutes, I still need that wood fire in there to get the fire going, because the coal isn't hot enough to contribute anything to the fire. At this point, I still have a little bit of wood remaining in the center of the fire, but I am getting a lot of coke development, and that is also contributing to the fire. So what I'm doing now is I'm taking the forged spoon and I'm taking the outside edges of the fire and I'm pulling them towards the center to take up the space that was occupied by the wood. And you can see already how that minor adjustment has made a big difference in the fire. The center is a little bit hotter and I'm getting a lot more smoke around the outside edges, so that they're getting a lot more heat as well. So even though it looked like I had a really super hot and intense fire, the reality is it wasn't as hot as it could be. There was still a lot of air that was just blowing right through the fire and not interacting with the coke. Now that there are no voids in the center of the fire, the air has to work its way around the coke, and that's going to turn the center of the fire into this white hot mass. So at this point the wood is totally gone and I've managed to generate a baseball-sized amount of coke in the center of the fire, and that's what's driving the whole fire right now. You can see how much hotter it's gotten, and you have a lot more smoke being generated around the outside of the fire. So that's all of the coal getting turned into coke, and it's driving off all of the impurities except for one. There is a tarry type substance that gets created in this process, and that tends to stick all of the lumps of coal together. So that lump of coke that I showed you earlier wasn't actually formed from one piece of coal. It was formed from several pieces of coal that have gotten glued together, and that whole mass turned into one lump of coke. So if I poke at the fire, you'll see how the whole back side of the fire is going to move as a unit. That's basically one big lump of coke that's forming. And the same thing is going to happen when I pull the front section away. So this fire was basically made up of those two sections and a few smaller bits that got broken away when I separated those two main sections of the fire. So I'm a little bit further along here. I managed to put all the coke back in the center of the fire while it was still hot enough to reestablish the fire. I didn't have to relight it. I just shoved all the pieces together and gave it some air and it took off. And I've piled a lot more fresh coal around the outside edges, and I'm going to let this run in real time so you get an idea of how quickly a fire can deteriorate if you don't look after it. So just to be clear, this is a very tight, well-packed fire. It's got a lot of fuel. There's a lot of raw coal around the outside. I could put a sewing needle on the top of this fire and it would stay there because it's solid. So when they're talking about a well-managed fire, this is what it looks like. It's a few minutes later now, and I'm sure from your perspective nothing much has happened, but the problem is the center of the fire is totally gone. The only parts that are burning are the faces of those bricks that are forming around the outside of the fire. So the top of the fire is basically one big coke brick that is self-supporting. And the main part of the fire, which should be the hottest part of the fire, has been totally consumed, so there is a huge cavity sitting just underneath of what you're looking at right here. The only things that are burning in this fire are the hot faces of those coke bricks that are forming around the outside edge. I can see right down to the bottom of the fire, and I can let my poker just drop right down to the bottom of the fire. If I were to put a bar in this fire, it would never get to forging temperature because it's just being blanketed by a blast of cold air. If I left the fire alone and just gave it more air, the hot faces would start being consumed themselves, and they would start moving away from the fire to a point where the air wouldn't be enough to maintain combustion and the whole fire would die. So here it's about a half hour later, and you're looking at the same fire, and I've pulled away the coke bricks that were forming on the left-hand side and the front half of the fire, and what you're looking at here is the buildup that was on the right-hand side and the back. And I know it's hard to get the same perspective as you would if you were standing in front of it, but you can see how there's just a mass that is hanging on the side of the fire pot. It's actually grown into the fire pot, but it's sitting there. You know, that stuff does not fall into the fire. You have to force it back into the fire because they just form this brick and they sit there. And it's really hard to convince new people when they're starting out that there's a problem with the fire. They see flames coming off the top and they think everything's all right. Now you have to understand that these large bricks only form when you're adding large amounts of fresh coal to a fire. In a properly managed fire, when you're routinely making sure that you're pushing out all the voids out of the center of the fire and then just adding enough coal around the outside edges to make up what you're losing in the center, this never becomes a problem because the mass of coal around the outside edges isn't large enough. Also, you have to understand that this only happens when the raw coal is starting to turn into coke. Once it turns into coke and you break it into pieces, you can leave it alone because they will not bond back together. They will stay as separate lumps. Now, I keep calling these things bricks, but don't get the idea that they're anywhere near as hard as bricks. This is more like a really, really soft styrofoam. So they're really easy to break apart. All you need to do is to stick a poker in the middle of one of them and it'll break into little pieces. Now, to confuse the issue further, you have to understand that you do want some clumping of the coal parts into larger chunks of coke because they stay in the fire. They don't just break down into small bits and fall through the grate really quickly. You want them to burn first before they turn into ash and fall through the grate. So you have to be careful. You have to strike a balance between breaking up these huge bricks that are forming and being so attentive to the fire that you're grinding everything into powder that's just going to fall through the grate before you can actually get a chance to burn it. Ideally, you're looking for lumps that are about the size of walnuts. They're large enough to stay in the fire, but there's still plenty of gaps around them to get a good airflow through, so you're going to get a really hot, intense fire out of these things. And they're sturdy enough that you're going to be able to make a good, solid fire out of them. Here I'm starting the fire back up again, but this time I'm using coke in the middle of the fire, and I'm going to be starting it with a torch, and you'll see how much easier it is when you're using coke rather than raw coal. Again, this is real time. I'm starting to give it air, and the fire is already going. I can pack more coke around the fire, and I'll be ready to go in a few minutes. I am a little bit further along, but that's because I needed to edit out me looking at the camera to make sure that it was still recording, so you're only missing about 30 seconds here. Here I'm just using the spoon to reposition the fire directly over the air grate. So at this point the fire is mainly coke. The smoke that you're seeing is probably just a little bit of coal dust that got mixed in with the coke, in the forge pan, so that's burning off. But there is no coal to speak of in the fire. So here I've determined that the fire isn't getting enough air. This quite often happens when you're compressing the fire and the sides of the fire get raked into the air grate and close it off. In this case, it probably happened when I repositioned the fire back over the grate. In any case, the solution is to take your poker and slide it underneath the fire and give it a little lift while you're cranking on the blower. Once the grate is clear, you will hear a noticeable difference in the intensity of the fire, and of course you will see a very noticeable difference in the flame. So if the fire pot that you're using is susceptible to this is just another step in the process, and it becomes part of the routine. You compress the fire, make sure it's tight, add some more coal around the outside edges and get that ready for the next round, and then you just give the fire a little lift, make sure that the grate is clear, and you're ready to work again. Sorry about my head getting in the way of the shot, but my coal bin is on the other side of the forge and I have to walk in front of the camera to get to it. In this case, I couldn't edit it out because I wanted you to see what I was doing in the fire. At this point, I'm pretty much back to where we started. I have a good solid fire. The center is burning up the coke that I used to start the fire. I've put raw coal around the outside, and the smoke is telling me that I'm going to have a new batch of coke to move to the center of the fire very shortly. At this point, I know that I'm going to need to start moving some coke into the center of the fire to make sure that I have that critical mass where I need it to heat up the metal. So I'm just taking my poker and just getting a feel for how the lumps are forming around the outside edge. If it feels like I'm sticking my poker into a pile of gravel, then I know I don't have anything to worry about yet. But if it starts to feel like I'm poking it into a piece of styrofoam, then I know that these bricks are starting to form, and I'm going to want to keep a close eye on them and break them up before they start getting out of hand. So now I'm ready to start moving the edges of the fire towards the center so that I can fill the voids that are being created. But I have a very different fire now. I can't actually use my spoon to reach around and grab the areas that I want to push into the center. So I'm going to need to force the edge of the spoon down the slope of the fire pot and let the material that's in front of the spoon push the sides of the fire into the center. There's a number of different ways you can get the same results. The old timers used to use a heavy pair of tongs, and they would hit the sides of the fire right up inside the edge of the fire pot, and compress the fire that way. That would do two things. It would break up the lumps, and again, it follows the side of the fire pot, so it compresses the fire towards the middle. If you have a poker that has a wide blade, you can do it with that as well. I like compressing the fire with my long-handled spoon because it gives me a much better feel of how solid the fire actually is. So that's basically all there is to it. You just have to be aware that the fire is something that needs constant maintenance, but don't overdo it. And you just eventually will fall into a routine where you compress the fire, make sure that the center is tight. You fill in the voids all around the outside of the fire with more coal. Check the smoky areas, to see how they're forming into lumps, and then just repeat the same process over and over again. It really only becomes a problem if you let the fire go down too small. There's a tendency to try to get every last bit of coal burnt up before you have to add more coal, and that is not the right approach. The best approach is to keep a good healthy fire and add small amounts of coal at a time. That way you don't have these big bucketfuls of coal that are turning into coke and forming into these large bricks. You have these thin layers of coal that are turning into strips of coal that are easy to break up just from, the usual fire management. And at the end of the day, I always pull apart my fire and keep an eye on it until it dies right out. It's just personal preference, but I feel better if I know that there's no possible way that a fire can get started in there once I lock the door and leave. And you can see how quickly the fire dies out when you pull apart all of the hot masses and, stop giving it air. So the first thing that you really need to concentrate on and to really understand, as far as I'm concerned, is the size of the fire that you need to build. Because the big problem that I see today is that people get the idea that, once you've lit 8 or 12 pieces of coal and you can heat up a 1/4 inch rod with it, then you're all right. You can start forging. Well, that really isn't the case at all. Um, what I have here is the shape of my fire pot. This shape of fire pot was pretty standard. Everybody made one that was very, very similar. This particular one came from the Canadian Forge and Blower Company, which I believe came out of Kitchener, Ontario. And I've had it for, since I started. I was very fortunate to find this as one of the first pieces of equipment that I ever bought. It is a good fire pot, and it's kind of the minimum size of fire that you are going to want to build. So as I mentioned, this is the fire. The air supply is coming in through the center here, and the two flanges that hold it into the actual forge come off the sides right here. So this depth is approximately 5 inches, and it's 8 inches across the front, and it's 10 inches deep. And it's basically cone shaped. It isn't exactly this shape. It has a kind of a radius down here, but essentially this is the volume of white hot coals that you're looking to generate in a good forge. So you can start to see how something like a brake drum forge or something smaller is going to fall quite short of this unless you have some way of building up the walls to create that depth of coal. And this is just a basic forging fire. I would use this for making things and it wouldn't be a problem. If I was going to try to forge weld in this fire, I would need to build it up another 4 or 5 inches and dome it up quite high. So what I do is I put 2 bricks on the side flanges, and then that gives me the height that I need to dome the fire even more. So I have 9 or 10 inches of depth in this fire when I'm forge welding or when I'm working a heavy piece of metal, like if I was reshaping a 3 pound or a 4 pound sledge into a cross peen. You need a big fire for that. You can't do it in a brake drum forge. You can't heat it with a torch. You just don't get the quality of heat that you have in a forge with a lot of coals. And that is the main thing that you really need to understand when you're putting together a forge. It isn't good enough to just have the coals lit and stick a rod in and have it heat up. That really isn't what you need when you're forging. Now, just because I was lucky enough to find a fire pot early on to build my forge doesn't mean that I haven't built my share of crappy forges. Even though I like some of the design features that I built into this forge, I really undersized the fire pot, so this design really didn't perform well at all. This design was the first time that I used a fire pot that just sort of plugs into the forge basin, making it something that can be easily modified or improved upon. And I've used that design in other forges, and I really like that aspect of it. But this particular fire pot really didn't perform at all because it's just way too small. This fire pot is built from a short length of 2x6 channel iron, and the sides are just too shallow to build up any kind of a bed of coals. There isn't enough there to really heat up the work, and the minute you turn your back on this fire, it just goes out. Here you can see a graphic comparison between this forge and my full-size forge. You can see how the volume just isn't there. This is the fire pot on the portable forge unit that I built for my bellows. Even though it appears to be roughly the same size as the first forge pot that I showed you, it is significantly wider. It's a full 8 inches, and the depth has been increased to 3 inches. So that little bit of an increase in depth as well as the width and making the top flanges level with the top of the fire pot give you the option to build a much bigger fire. With this design, to make sure that the wooden frame didn't get too hot, I made the inside frame a little bit smaller so there's good air circulation around the forge to keep the wood cold. And here again, even though this forge is a great improvement on my last one, and it does allow me to do all the work that I need to do when I'm demonstrating to the public, the critical mass of the forge still falls well short of what I need to do general forging work in the shop. This is the last fire pot that I built, and the channel section is actually made out of 2 heavy angle irons. They're 4x4-inch angle irons welded together in the center, and you can just barely make out that seam. The sides of this fire pot are vertical, and the front and back slope is just created by welding in a 1/4-inch piece of plate. And then I use the 1/8 inch flat bar to create the flange around the top edge. Here you can see how I place some bricks on the side when I need to increase the depth of the fire. I didn't have my cardboard model when I took these pictures, but this fire pot is very close in size to my forge. It's just about an inch shallower, so these bricks really do make up the difference when I need it. I just want to point out that I always use straight bars as a fire grill anytime I build a fire pot. I'm not a big fan of the shower drain design where you just simply drill a bunch of holes to create a fire grate. And the reason for that is because these fire pots are not made with a clinker breaker or a tumbler that allows you to clean out any obstructions around the air inlet. So you need to be able to reach in there with a poker and clean out anything that might be blocking the air. When you're using a straight bar setup like this, you're going to be able to reach into the fire with a poker and find those spaces and rake back and forth until the obstruction is cleaned out. It's very hard to reach into a fire and find a series of small holes to clean out whatever you need to clean out. So I find this design to be much better. Now, these last few examples have relied heavily on being able to weld pieces together to build a fire pot, but if you don't have access to that, you do have other options. For example, if you still want to go with a steel construction, you could bend it up out of a solid piece, You can bolt the whole thing together using corner brackets or, designing in flanges that can be bolted together. So, you do have options. A lot of forges, especially around here where there was a lot of lumbering going on, the lumber camp forges were basically just a big wooden box that was filled with dirt. And at the top layer, they would lay in a 2 or 3 inch layer of clay that would come down and then back up and basically form the pot out of that. The clay would harden and then, it would last the 2 or 3 seasons that they were working there and then they would move on. For the air supply, they would take a pipe, larger than this, but, roughly 3 inches. They would saw in air grates into the pipe, and then at the other end, and they would just block with a big wooden cork. Air supply would come in this way, come up through the forge. When they wanted to clean the forge out, they uncorked it, put a cloth over top of the air grate, and then cranked the blower really hard to push all the stuff and the slag and the clinkers out through the end of the pipe. They'd cork it back up, and away they went. So, that is by far, the cheapest option. There are a lot of forges. They're, more industrial sized forges, and they don't have a fire pot at all. They're basically just a big flat brick table that has a high ledge, and the ledge allows them to pile coal inside of that pan, however many hundreds of pounds it takes to fill that pan. And at that point, the depth of the coal becomes the depth of the fire pot. They would dig in the center over top of the air grate, start the fire, and then pile the coal around it. The coal is actually making the fire pot. They would water down the outside to keep it under control. And then, so they would work that way, just keep piling in more coal as it burnt away. So, there's an option that actually doesn't require any kind of fire pot at all. It does require a good cheap supply of coal because you're going through a lot of it, just, the initial volume just to fill the fire pan, but it's a workable idea. When I bought my blower, it came with a Buffalo Forge fire pan, and I bought that as well. It was all part of a unit. The fire pot on that had rotted away, and the blacksmith had replaced it with clay and metal. Nothing was fastened together. He just lined the whole inside of the pan with clay, shaped a fire pot, and then when the clay was still wet, he just pressed heavy metal plates into the side to form the fire pot. So, you know, uh, I don't know how long it had been used that way, but it was obviously a workable solution. And this wasn't a lumber camp forge. This was an actual forge in a village. So this thing was being used every day. And that was the solution that he used. It was just clay and metal and nothing else. The last thing I want to discuss is the air supply. Um, Again, it's a very critical part to the whole fire. It controls the environment within the fire, and it determines the size of the fire that you can build. So the standard thing, of course, is just a regular hand cranked blower, but there are other options. I've built fairly good forges using bathroom exhaust fans. I've seen people use leaf blowers and different fans like that. A lot of people have used the fan that's in an automobile because it's a 12 volt. They hook it up to a battery and it's got the variable speed. So that's a very good option as well, or a workable option. The important thing when you're figuring out the air supply that you're using is forges want a high volume of air but very low pressure. Uh, so what that does, it supplies enough air to create the fire, but the pressure isn't there to raise the oxidation layer up higher. So the air comes in, filters through all the coals, gets the fire hot, but you're not creating an oxidizing environment any higher than you have to. So if you have a high pressure blast, it's going to find the weak spot in your bed of coals and it's going to drill right through that and then create an oxidizing area right next to your work, and it'll start burning up. So it's going to be very, very hard to keep a very dense mass of coals in your fire pot, and that's very, very important. You want to keep the coals tightly packed as much as possible when you're working. You don't want to create a hollow area underneath, because this area right through here is going to start burning out first, and you'll start seeing a black area when you look into the fire. That's because there's a big hollow that's been burnt away. You have to keep pushing the coals towards the center of the fire to pack that fire tight so that the air comes in, but it has to filter its way, find its way through all the coals to get out. You don't want to have a high pressure blast that just kind of just drills itself through the bed of coals. So that's really all you need to know about the air supply. I prefer a hand crank blower. I really prefer a bellows. I think that's probably my favorite method, but they are bulky. I have a series on building the bellows that I'm using. There's a lot of options for that. I built it out of real wood and leather, but you could do plywood and any kind of a tight woven fabric that will, trap the air enough to create a bellows. Or, I've seen people use pond liners. You have options. The size that I've described in the bellows videos is perfect for a small forge. So you don't need to go any bigger than that. I wouldn't go much smaller, but that creates a good volume of air and will supply a good sized fire. In my first video on how to design a blacksmith's forge, I brought out this model to illustrate the size difference between a typical fire that was held in a conventional fire pot that was available up until about the 1950s and your typical brake drum forge. Since then, I've been getting a lot of questions about the size of this model and how to put it together and that sort of thing. So in this video, I've decided to just walk you through the whole process, and hopefully that'll answer any questions you may have. As you can see, the fire pot is funnel shaped, and the front and back panels are 8 inches across the top, and the side panels are 10 inches across the top. And the overall depth is approximately 5 inches. And all 4 sides slope down to a 4-inch square opening at the base. The first thing you need to do to figure out the pattern for this model is to draw a full-size pattern of the front and side views of the firebox. The vertical line that I've drawn on the cardboard is the center line that I'm going to use for both views. And at 90 degrees to that line, I'm going to draw the top edge of the fire pot. I'm only going to be drawing half of the fire pot because that's going to give me all the information that I'm going to need to figure out the lengths of the sides. The 2 marks that I've drawn are the top corners of the front and the side panels. Now I'm going to measure in the overall height for the fire pot. So this line is where the base of the fire pot sits. Since the base of the fire pot is a 4-inch square, I only need to draw a 2-inch mark here to define the base. Now that I have these points laid out, I can draw in the lines that represent the angled sides of the fire pot. Since I'm only after one measurement from each one of these layouts, I can easily overlap them without causing any confusion. So just to be clear, what I have drawn on the cardboard is the end view of the fire pot, and the sloping line that's resting up against my drafting square is the length of the side panel, not the end panel. And the same is true for the sloping line that represents the side view of the fire pot. So the line that I've just drawn is the actual length of the end panels, even though it's found on the drawing for the side panels. So again, when I build the actual patterns, the overall length that I'm going to be looking for the side patterns is going to be found on the end view, and the overall length for the pattern for the end panels is going to be found on the side view. So all I need to do to figure out the total depth of each one of these panels is to measure these two lines. So now I'm ready to start drawing out the actual patterns. I've drawn in the center line and the top edge of the pattern. Now I need to add in the overall depth of the pattern piece. And this is the end panel, so I'm going to be measuring the longer line from the side view to get the overall depth of that pattern piece. And the length of that line is 5 7/8. So that's where I'm going to be locating the base of this pattern piece. And the end panel is 8 inches across the top, so I'm going to be laying in a 4-inch mark to define the top corner of that panel. And here I'm extending that line to the full 8 inches for the top. And again, the base of the pattern piece is 4 inches across. Just connect the dots and you're done this pattern piece. And it's exactly the same process for the side panels. The overall length for that pattern piece is found on the end view drawing that I've made, and that happens to be 5.5 inches. Before you cut the patterns out, it's always good to do a quick check. If everything's right, these two edges should be exactly the same length because they need to fit together on the corner. And as it turns out, they're not the same length, so I've got to figure out where I screwed up. And the first thing I checked is where the problem was. I was a little short on this panel, so I need to extend the baseline down slightly. Now that I've redrawn the line, I'm going to double check everything and make sure that it all adds up. It's really important to take the time to make sure that the pattern pieces are as close as you can possibly make them. You have to remember from here you're probably going to be going to 1/4 or 1/2 inch plate. So if something is wrong there, you need to be able to hold up the pattern piece to the plate and figure out what's off. If your plate is off and your pattern piece is off, then you have no reference. You have no way of figuring out where the problem is and what you need to do to fix it. And here are all the pattern pieces assembled into the mock-up for the fire pot. Again, this is just for the shape of the fire pot that I'm using, which is a Buffalo Forge fire pot that was probably available until the late 1950s or so. The shape isn't all that critical. You can go a little bit larger on any of the dimensions and it's not going to affect anything. All I was trying to get across with the first video is that as long as you amass this volume of coals, a taller fire rather than a low flat fire, you're going to have a good fire for forge welding or general forge work. The only part that needs to be added to this is the grate at the bottom of the fire pot, and I use a straight bar grate, and I always orient the bars so that they're parallel to the sides. It just makes using the poker that much easier, and it's fairly easy to construct. If you weld it from the bottom, if it ever burns out or if you ever have any problems with it, it's very easy to remove. So those are about the only considerations that I would have. And of course, there's a top flange on the top edge of this fire pot, but you'll have to build that to suit whatever it is you're doing. As well, you may need to modify these dimensions slightly to accommodate the thickness of the plates that you're using and whatever you're planning to do for an edge preparation prior to welding. But regardless of the final dimensions you plan on using, the process of laying out the patterns remains the same. Hi, and welcome back. Today I'm going to give you a quick tour of how I have my exhaust hood set up for my forge. So this is how my forge looks from the inside. I'm using a side draft forge hood, but the way I needed to set it up, the actual opening to the hood is quite a distance from the center of my forge. So I have this square box that you see sitting on top of my forge, and that basically is just a smoke catcher. It captures any amount of heat that is generated when I start up the forge, and it directs it into the opening of the forge hood. So basically anything in there is going to get sucked up the chimney. This box isn't attached to anything, it's just sitting on my forge, and it's basically just to make sure that all of the air that gets sucked into the stack has to go across the top of my fire pot. And this is how the smoke catcher looks from the back. The two pieces of angle iron just keep the box aligned with the opening of the side draft hood, and the round bar across the bottom just keeps the sides from splaying out. And this is the actual opening of the side draft hood. This measures approximately 6 by 14 inches, which comes in around 84% of the stack volume that I have. The ladle is showing you the location of the center of my fire pot, and you can see how it's quite a distance away from the opening to the hood. Ideally, these need to be located as close to the fire pot as possible. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to set it up that way, so I have it sitting on the end of the fire pot as opposed to the side, which is where they normally are located and where they work the best. When I first installed the hood, I had an extension coming out from the top of the forge hood opening, which extended pretty close to the center of the fire pot. And it was hoped that that would direct enough hot air into the forge to generate draft that I needed, but that wasn't the case. There was too much air short-circuiting underneath this hood, and that was just killing the draft. So, it really didn't draw well at all. So I had no choice but to totally enclose that space and build a box that just fit around it. Now all the air comes in through that opening and it has to go over the forge. So that preheats the air going into the hood, and that just creates a really tremendous draft. And that draft starts the minute I light the torch to get the fire going. I have my forge mounted in front of an old window opening, so the forge hood actually extends through that window opening to a box which is mounted on the outside of the building. And the sole purpose of this box is to have somewhere to mount the chimney stack. I have it built here as a large square box because that was the easiest way to block up the window opening and mount it to the outside of the building. But this can be built any way that you want. The important thing is to maintain the proportions between the actual opening to the hood and the volume of the stack. One thing that a lot of people don't realize is that the volume of your stack does not need to be contained in one unit. Here I have two just regular 8-inch stovepipes, and it's because that's what I had on hand and that's all I could afford at the time. And the two volumes combined add up to roughly an area of 100 square inches, which is the minimum that you want to use for a forge. When these pipes rot out, I will be building a heavy gauge sheet metal square stack, but this system works fine and I've used it for years because it was cheap to maintain and easy to install. So here I have everything back together and I'm starting to light the forge. I'll try to make it extra smoky so you can see how the air flows through the hood. So here I'm just taking a bunch of raw coal and I'm just stacking it on top of the forge and piling it up. And even though there's only like a small handful of coals that are lit underneath this pile of raw coal, you can still see how the smoke is being dragged sideways into the hood. And here you can see in the top corner where I'm pointing, the hood is actually filled with smoke and it's trying to roll out the front edge, but it's continually being sucked back in by the flow of air going over the fire.